Hi friends. Welcome to the riveting panel on completing the private security lifecycle, custody and secondary trading on the blockchain. What we would like to discuss is the changes taking place in private markets and how to make private securities more liquid and transparent. Do you guys know anything about that? So I'm Stephanie Holt. I am the COO of the North Capital Companies. And if you guys could just take a second to introduce yourself and tell us about your company.
So my name is Joan Adler, and I'm an attorney with Eleanor Grossman and Scholl. We are regulatory and general corporate securities counsel to North Capital. And we work with North Capital and other stakeholders in bringing liquidity and new programs to the capital markets.
Cool. I'm Jake, go by Mo. I work at Consensus, which is a parent company of Meridio, which is a subsidiary within Consensus. I'm one of the co-founders of Meridio. Consensus is the world's largest blockchain company. We build on Ethereum blockchain, which is where all the applications are being built today. Jill Lubin, our CEO for Consensus, is one of the co-founders of Ethereum, the protocol itself. Before joining Consensus, my background, I worked in real estate at BlackRock in their direct investments group. And then before that, I was at Boston Consulting Group in their private equity practice.
And I'm Jim Dowd. I'm the founder and CEO of North Capital. And we work with platform intermediaries, with issuers, and with institutional investors across providing a broad range of services, but primarily focused on offering transaction settlement, custody, and soon secondary trading of exempt securities. So basically anything that is not currently listed, either private securities or exempt public securities.
Hi, my name is Anton Prakash. I am the CEO of Efron Tech. I'm also the CTO of North Capital, and together we build the technology stack for all the products that North Capital has been using and will be using in the various business spaces. And my background is in software development and IT operations and solution development space, mainly in the the fintech space.
Okay, so let's talk about custody. So I know that custody is not really that new of a thing. I have a Schwab account. I have a lot of amazing stocks in there. So I know custody exists. But Jim, can you maybe describe to us the problem that we're currently trying to solve with custody and private placements?
Sure. So the main issue with private offerings is that they fall outside of the normal custody system for stocks and funds. And anybody that sort of has any type of private investment, whether it's a limited partnership interest in a hedge fund or a private equity fund or a venture fund, or a investment in a private real estate vehicle, will know that their relationship is typically directly with the issuer and not with any type of custodial intermediary. And that typically sort of works fine if you're doing sort of a self-directed investing and you're responsible and happy to kind of hold all of your own account information. But if you, let's say, have a relationship with an investment advisor and you have sort of managed money, or if, let's say, that you have a lot of private investments and you don't want to have to keep track of where everything is, then it works not particularly well, because the information is not centralized either from a reporting standpoint or from a record-keeping standpoint. It may be difficult to know exactly what the pricing is or the estimated performance on different investments, on sort of a similar time frame. And where it really makes a difference is when you move into the sort of the managed money or advised money world. Advisors are essentially not willing to do a lot with exempt securities or exempt fund interest, because it's a pain, and they're, they can't consolidate, they can't report, they can't bill, and frankly, when they try to transact, it may appear to the client that money is just leaving the brokerage account, so then it raises issues of, is my advisor committing fraud? So in general, what we're trying to solve for is to create essentially a solution that allows people, if they want to kind of bring those assets into one location to be able to do, from a reporting and from a record keeping standpoint. And then just one other point is that with respect to qualified accounts like IRAs, you actually have a requirement to have a qualified custodian for those types of accounts. So unless you have made those arrangements, then you can't have certain of those investments in those types of accounts. So that's kind of the other reason why people use custodians.
Those, can I jump in?
Yep, of course you
I was
can.
going to say, those are a lot of problems and challenges. I would say, given this is a blockchain panel, I'll chime in and how blockchain could potentially solve for some of those challenges. So if you think of blockchain merely as a ledger that everyone can kind of trust and see transparently, who owns what potentially, it can do a good job of solving for some of those challenges, right? So, maybe you have all these investors in a private placement where the sponsor or the issuer has first right of refusal and control. You still need to be able to give confidence to those investors, to regulators, and to other parties that these are the folks that owned X amount for this long, and this is kind of where they reside. So, in my view, blockchain does aim to solve for some of those challenges. I think custody itself is evolving, so you're no longer going to see, the Bank of New York Mellons out there at solving it at an institutional scale. But if a new technology could potentially solve for things like escrow, things like who owns what and when, I think it's exciting that there are folks like NorthCap that are thinking about how do we pioneer and solve for that problem today using this technology. So.
And so just to follow up on that for a second, so as a practical matter for me as an investor then, does this mean that, like my great Schwab account that I told you guys about, does this mean that I would have an actual statement that showed my private securities instead of having, a desk drawer full of subscription documents that I'd signed and then not really know what goes on with that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you're talking about dealing with a qualified custodian, then that's in fact one of the regulatory requirements is that you have to receive at least a quarterly statement of your account and periodic valuation. So yeah, that would be part of it, is to kind of bridge that gap for the people who want to have that, sort of familiar, engagement through their advisor or, directly with a custodian.
So Joan, tell us about some of the regulatory hurdles, both moving into custody for privates and then also having it on the blockchain.
Okay.
Is that a long discussion?
No. It's just a different question. So, in terms of private securities, part of the issue that we have or people have with private securities is there's a different liquidity market than there is for public securities. So public securities can be traded on over the counter, they could be on an exchange. When you have private securities, accessing the ability to sell or buy some more is not as publicly open. There's very limited opportunities to sell and to find potential buyers or sellers of those securities. And so, one of the things that the private markets are scrambling with is, what do we do about this? How do we open up the liquidity for this? And interestingly enough, the chair of the SEC keeps saying that there's an ever-increasing growing private market, and we need to bring more of the investing public into this private market. One of the things that our law firm, L&L Grossman & Scholl, is doing in conjunction with NorthCap and another party that was instrumental in bringing about the Jobs Act and the crowdfunding exemption is we're working with the SEC and then the state regulators, because nothing happens in securities transactions unless you either register or are exempt on the federal level, and then again on the state level. And it's often the state level that trips people up because they can find their way through the federal laws, but then you've got to deal with the laws of the state, and you're not only dealing with where are the buyers, but then where are the sellers, and then where are the agents, and so on and so forth. So one of the solutions that we're looking to bring about is access to information, to educate the public, bring the public a quantum of information that might be something equivalent to what's available to public companies. And so we're going to be working, there's no federal kind of pathway. There are some federal pathways, but they're limited. There's a preemption on the federal level, so no state law, but it has to be sold privately on the primary issuance and then again on the secondary issuance, and it has to be limited to accredited investors. And so you're, again, blocking out huge portions of the investing public. So this is one of the things that we're working on, forward thinking to anticipate and address solutions. And certainly going back to your initial question about the blockchain, not everything is going to be in the private markets with a transfer agent. The blockchain can open up the ledgering of who's got what, when they have it, how much they have it, when did they buy it, when did they sell it, who did they sell it out to, and so forth. And so it kind of, gives flex to the record-keeping exercise as opposed to a ledger sitting on an Excel spreadsheet at the issuer, where you can then kind of, centralize the data and also have it more broadly available to people.
Of course you can. You're
Go right
welcome.
ahead.
I think you raised excellent points. If you look at blockchain and what it does, I don't know how many folks are familiar with smart contracts, but that is one of the core features of a blockchain, especially Ethereum, right? So you're able to build these smart contracts, or essentially digital shares, that can capture the rules and regulations that are required from a private securities perspective, whether it's a Reg D offering, whether there are restrictions that you want to capture from a regulation perspective or from a business logic perspective. And that's where you really start to see the power of something like blockchain, right? So you no longer need multiple parties kind of jumping in and saying, okay, you can't transact because of X, Y, or Z reason. You can encode that logic into these smart contracts where you don't need to rely on all these folks, and that obviously cuts down the cost significantly. I would say we do need to work with folks like Jay Clayton's team at the SEC and FINRA and whoever it may be to think through the details when we create these standards or these templates. So, if the smart contract is something that the SEC says is a good representation of a Reg D offering, we need input from the regulators, right? So, and it's exciting to see that everyone's kind of on board about that. Yeah,
Sure.
my 2 cents.
So Anton, tell us about developing this on the blockchain, developing a custody system on the blockchain, and sort of what that entails, and what that maybe looks like in the future.
Yeah. So, like any advancement in technology, blockchain is also, where opportunity is a challenge, and then challenge is an opportunity. So basically, it provided a blockchain has opened up, some unknown ways to, solve problems that we, and custody is a great example of that. But practically working with blockchain and implementing it, some of the stuff, where technology makes it possible, especially blockchain, Ethereum would allow the ability for, architecting a solution using tokens, and either fungible or non-fungible tokens, or standard smart contract that would establish the conditions in it. And then I would hear from Jim saying, oh, that's not going to go, from a regulatory standpoint. There has to be a transfer agent, process. You can't just, transfer the tokens and then, account it for. It has to be, and, coming from a tech side, I really want to solve the problem, and easy to solve, but that may not, so it's like a two-sided sword. What gives us as an opportunity also, is a hurdle that you have to, kind of get through to do it, but overall, so in the evolution of our recent times, from the standard desktop computers to internet, and then followed by the cell phone, I think blockchain creates the massive opportunity to hack and solve a large amount of problems, and fintech space is like obviously the one that kind of get to gain from it. But the knowledge of technical implementation and also the regulatory framework around that is really important to really get things out. One or the other alone is not going to be enough.
So do you feel like the technology, and I understand it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg, right? But do you feel like the technology is there and the technology is ready and it can be done? It's just in what regulatory framework it'll work at this point? Or, is there more to be done on the technology too?
Is that for me?
You're welcome to.
Sure. So I think the technology is in early days, right? Especially something like Ethereum. To give you a sense, a transaction settles in 13 seconds. But that doesn't mean you can put also large amounts of data on a blockchain, right? So a blockchain makes sense for transactions, but not necessarily storing large volumes of data. We think the technology has a long way to go still, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean we can't create a digital representation of shares. Meridio specifically is focused on creating private placements of real estate, and we've done that already. So that's kind of exciting. It's not something we need the technology to evolve. Now, if you need to be able to settle, 1 billion transactions in, 13 seconds, right? That's going to take some time. But if we take a step back and think about where the internet started in 2000, could you have built Facebook on that version of the internet? Probably not. My mom would probably be yelling at me for clogging up the dial-up. But today we don't think about it twice, right? It's amazing in terms of where the technology has evolved and what that has led to in terms of applications that are now being built. And we'll see something very similar for blockchain as a technology.
So custody was sort of step one of what we're talking about today. Let's talk a little bit about secondary trading.
Sure.
Sort of the current framework with secondary trading for private placements. I don't know, Jim, you want to answer, sort of what's the current framework and why maybe the way it is currently, does that make people not want to do private placements?
Yeah. So the current framework is that you invest in a private placement, you get back your confirmation, you stick in a file cabinet, and then you hope eventually it monetizes. I mean, that's the reality. There's very little secondary transaction activity in privates or frankly in unlisted public offerings unless there's some sort of liquidity mechanism built into the actual instrument. So, one of the areas where there's been a lot of talk about, the use of kind of exempt securities and particularly Reg A plus is in non-traded REITs, which have a potential sort of built-in liquidity mechanism where the issuer itself can provide liquidity in certain circumstances, but that's going to be limited. And it's not the same as the traded REITs that you see on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, where if you decide that you want to get out of a position, you call your broker, you place a trade, and you're out the same day. So right now there's really nothing, and a big part of what we've been trying to do, we've kind of framed it around this acronym, which is basically, we kind of figured out an acronym that would be easy to remember, and then sort of tied it to kind of the thematics of our business. But it's ALTS. It's access, liquidity, transparency at scale. And the idea is that if you have liquidity, transparency, and you can do it at scale, then you're going to expand the access to the market because you're going to get a lot more people interested in those types of securities. I mean, there's whole groups of investors who won't invest in illiquid securities because they believe that it undermines the rest of their business. And it's kind of interesting. We're a little bit schizophrenic within our own company in that we have, on the broker-dealer side, we're working at sort of building this liquidity transparency at scale, but then we have an advisory business and we do nothing in illiquid securities on the advisory side. And part of the reason why is because I never want to be the guy on the receiving end of a phone call with a client who says, get me out of this position, and I have to say, I can't, right? And so at some point, I think those businesses will combine in some way, but for now, I think that it's a real shortcoming of the private market that we don't have that liquidity in secondary trading, and I think it's going to change. I mean, that's a little bit of an argument, sort of almost like religion. I mean, there are people who think that people don't want liquidity, issuers don't want liquidity, investors don't care about liquidity, and then there's sort of other people who think that, well, if you had liquidity and if you had transparency in secondary trading, you actually would get a lot more people participating. And I don't know the answer to that, but I'm willing to kind of bet the ranch that if you add liquidity and you add secondary trading, you're going to get a lot more people involved.
So, Joan, what side of the argument do you come down on that?
You should absolutely try and bring more liquidity into the market. You can't lose it. Not only does it help the people who are in the securities, but if someone is conducting a primary offering and the potential investors know that they're going to be able to at least identify one way or another how they can get out of it, should they want to, should they need to, it helps people get in the first instance. So you're not only creating more in the secondary market, but you're also helping the cost of capital in the front end, because the sales barrier will be that much lower. So, for example, right now you have, Rule 144, and, are you a public entity or are you a private entity? How long do I have to hold it for? Is it under Rule 4A7? Is it, can I do this? Am I eligible for one of these secondary market, which are very few and far between, and you have to be an insider, and it has to be on, some kind of special platform, and you have to be accredited. So your resale opportunities are very, very limited. If these things are broadened out under the securities law, you're going to be able to get into the market better. You're going to be able to get out of the market better. The issuers are going to benefit. The investors will benefit. So, yeah,
So is the goal for the private market to mirror the public market?
In many respects, yes.
And but that also requires regulatory change.
It does require regulatory change. And it also requires something that some issuers may or may not want to participate in, which is disclosure. So a lot of things are helped by disclosure. How much are you willing to put out there? The world changed with 506C because now you have, the jumbo shrimp of the securities market. You have publicly offered private placements. And so issuers are getting in the sense, they're getting into custom, they're getting more familiar with putting their private information out there. So this is literally a logical next step, is that they're going to get used to or begin to embrace the concept of putting out regular updates to the information that they made available to the investing public, and getting into a habit of making these updates more available on some schedule or some disclosure calendar and so forth. And who benefits? The investors. Because let's put it this way, if you invest in a private company, how often do you hear from them? I'm an investor in a private company. I don't know what they're doing. I have no idea, right? So everybody is going to gain by that exercise. So and that's probably part of the pitch to the regulators, is, the investing public will have more information. It's going to be this trickle over effect of mass disclosure.
So, Mo, in your specific example with your company,
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit about how the combination of custody and the additional liquidity of secondary trading could change your business?
Yeah, so I guess two components there, right? Custody and then secondary trading, and they're probably related with each other. When I think about custodianship, I think about regulation, and I think about where blockchain adds value, right? So for us, working with Jim and NorthCap, I think it's exciting to see that regulators are thinking about custodianship from a blockchain perspective because it is very different, right? You don't have shares sitting in one central server. You have it all in a ledger. That ledger needs to be sort of settled and opined on by whoever the parties that need to govern it. And where NorthCap, I think, is thinking about solving for this will be very interesting and something that allows capital to come in from both retail and institutional investors in a regulatory compliant way. From Meridio's perspective, right, we're creating fractional ownership of real estate, right? That's not a new idea. There are non-traded REITs. There's LP interest. But I think what you said was pretty interesting, right? Like it's not necessarily liquidity that we're chasing, but it's the information associated with these private placements, right? That transparency component. And if you can create more, let's call it efficient markets, not just liquid markets, you need to be able to share that information, right, with whoever the investors may be. So not necessarily immediately solving for liquidity, but at least allowing the participants to be able to see information associated with their private investments to transact amongst each other, and not only going to the sponsor of the NTR to buy back those shares at a pretty significant discount. And that makes things like capital calls interesting. So right, like you don't have to. Maybe the only time you hear from your private company investment is when they need more money, but maybe they can go to a much larger pool, right? And maybe when they are doing that, you have an opportunity to get out of your investment that you've been beholden to for X amount of time. But the reason you'll be able to do that in a more efficient manner is because not only do you have good custodianship, but you also have the data behind that individual asset that allows you to then make that informed decision. So I don't think things turn liquid overnight. I don't think investor behavior will necessarily evolve immediately just because they're smaller units. There'll still be a consortium of passive investors and active investors. We just want to create a more efficient way for them to engage with one another.
Sure. So Anton, when you hear this, if we're trying to mirror the public to the private, or the private and the public markets, and you've worked on a custody solution on the blockchain, how do you feel when we talk about putting everything on the blockchain? And more importantly, how are you going to make that happen?
Yeah. Good question. Just before answering that, so the about the trading of securities in the secondary market, the trading systems itself. Again, I'm piggybacking on my earlier comment on what technology provides us a capability to solve a solution versus what can be or should be done. So there's a lot of initiatives as to trading systems being, either being like centralized exchanges, where tokens are traded between, parties versus decentralized exchanges where, completely disconnected and just tokens are exchanged in between. I recently came to know with the private securities, you cannot implement a centralized exchange. You cannot do a decentralized exchange. It has to be a centralized exchange. So there is like what technology platform offers versus what you can build in every small initiative to larger. It's a learning process to ongoing. Now, coming to the main question, I think, like putting everything on the blockchain to trade, there are a few things. One is, by the way, this month is the 10th anniversary of the Bitcoin white paper, September 2008, and, in 1989, Berners-Lee, wrote the specs for the hypertext, and the birth of web as a protocol from the internet was born. And I read this interesting stats in 1999, which is 10 years later from that, let's call that white paper, although we know who Berners-Lee is, whereas we don't know who
Satoshi is.
Satoshi is. And there were only 300 million people were using the web. And this is, there were a few commercial offerings. Amazon was already there, Yahoo was already there, but web was limited to only 300 million people 10 years later. And in blockchain, again, the 10th anniversary is there, but the impact that it has made, it is clearly visible, whether the crypto aspect of that, where it's going to go, but definitely blockchain as a transformational platform is going to, stay on for a very long time, and new initiatives are going to be coming in. Just to answer your part, one is the wallet security. I think, that is one limiting factors, before a larger adoption of anything and everything can be put in the blockchain for trading, that, and I was recently at this Cato Institute event where, I raised that question, and the general consensus about that is, how people, sort of, created their own email address and safeguarded their passwords, and eventually, this is still email is a very centralized server-based, solution delivery. It's not a decentralized one, and the common public will figure out how to create a wallet and save, keep the, the security for themselves, type of thing. And it hasn't happened yet, but that needs to happen. And the second one is like, anyone who works in, blockchain kind of needs to understand how it works, so, and we need to cross that hump, in order for that, because anyone who uses email doesn't know how the email works, they just send an email and then the other person receives that, whereas anyone who works on blockchain will have to explain how blockchain works, and they would have that intimate, that knowledge. And that requirement for that knowledge has to, completely go down, even in an advanced group like a fintech, area, before, securities trading and all the other, asset-backed securities are trained, and also just pure information storage like title and other things, in the real estate world, can be stored. Everything is possible right now with the combination of blockchain, with the off-chain, sort of, storage mechanisms and all of that. But in order for a larger adoption to happen, these two things have to be solved.
Right. So that's a great segue for me. So just, for the last couple of minutes, if everybody could take a minute or two and tell me sort of what you think the next 12 to 24 months look like, more from maybe a realistic aspect than a aspirational one, not what we hope will happen, but, based on, your knowledge of how regulation moves and, your specific knowledge of industry, what do you think the next 12 to 24 months look like?
More lobbying than action. Working with regulators, there's a lot of phone calls, meetings, letter writings, advocacy. Maybe, it depends on the appetite. So regardless of the fact that Chair Clayton is talking about his mission to open up the floodgates to the investing public, it still needs to be implemented. And therein lies the rub, because then you have all the, regulatory people that have to come up with concept releases and, what the rules would look like, what they would entail, what are the, what's the mission. And, once you reach out on the federal level and you get, let's say, something that takes some kind of shape and form, then you need to trickle it down into the states. The state's not one, it's 54 different jurisdictions, and they all have an opinion. And so maybe you work with the North American Securities Administrators to get a model rule, but you're looking at not probably much more than advocacy and maybe something taking shape over the next 12 to 24 months.
I would probably second regulation, hopefully, is something I'm excited for, and I think a lot of people in the blockchain space are excited about. In the next, 12 to 24 months, I think adoption of actual applications and real use cases is something I'm looking forward to. When you go on Amazon or you log onto your bank account on your phone, you don't really necessarily think about, how, what you're seeing and what's going on behind custody, what's going on with the internet or what TCP/IP, right? So I'm excited to see something similar happen for blockchain. I guess for us, or one thing I'd probably want to emphasize is, it's not something that's that far off into the future, right? The first project that we worked on from a real estate perspective was putting titles on blockchain, and we did that with the government of Dubai, and that was a year ago. So 9 years after the blockchain white paper, the Bitcoin white paper, excuse me. And now we've gone beyond that, right? So now it's looking at these traditional securities offerings and how do we add value on a blockchain-based system there, and then of course continuing to accelerate that. So that's kind of my view.
And I think we'll see, kind of more what I would call kind of hybrid adoption. And what I mean by that is I agree with Joan that we're not going to get a lot of new regulation or maybe even a lot of clarification, specifically with respect to crypto digital assets. But what I think we will see is firms starting to incorporate the technology within sort of the incumbent, what we refer to as the incumbent infrastructure. So, we're not going to change the way, we're not going to rewrite the custody rules, but maybe we can find a way to adapt the technology to provide a better delivery mechanism in the custody rules. And is an example, from a technology standpoint, I remember kind of in the early days of open source, technology, and there was a big sort of, fundamental debate about, does open source have a future? Because, you can't license it, so who's going to make open source? Because if you can't license it, then you can't get paid. And if you can't get paid, then you're not going to be able to attract developers. And if you can't attract developers, then the technology is going to advance. And of course, we found out that was completely flawed. And anybody that made that argument, 10 years ago looks ridiculous today because the entire internet is run on open source technology. And I think blockchain is going to be very similar. I mean, I've kind of been, it's been interesting to kind of look at this argument between sort of public and private blockchains. And I think that, and people are talking about using private blockchains in the context of existing regulations. And I similarly think that's sort of a ridiculous argument because to me, one of the big benefits and where we'll start to get the benefits of network effect is, having open source technology that can be widely disseminated. And if everybody in this room basically decided tomorrow, those that haven't decided this, we're going to standardize on Ethereum, and you get one or two other securities firms deciding we're going to standardize on Ethereum, pretty soon you start to have, critical mass standardizing Ethereum, and then there's really no need to do something private because people decide that would rather build additional security layers and additional, protocol protections on top of that existing thing. So I don't think we need like a lot of movement from the government, to be able to see this innovation happen. I think we as an industry need to figure out a way, how do we fit within and around and within the nooks and crannies of the existing regulation, and then make use of the technology, like take advantage of the fact that there's some real economies of scale that can happen simply because this is really cool, very good technology that seems like it was purpose built for the securities business. I mean, it's incredible that you can build applications so quickly, and I think that's going to make an impact in the next 24 months.
So next 12 to 24 months, so one is on the blockchain side of things, I have a small disagreement with what you said, Jim, regarding private blockchain. But before that, the Bitcoin itself, Bitcoin network using the proof of work method, has been continuing to consume the energy level. And I recently read it's like, an annual consumption of Bitcoin to keep stake, just the verification using the proof of work method is 28 terawatt an hour on a 12-month trailing thing, which is 50% more than the entire country of Ecuador. On the energy needs. So, that at some point, that is going to be viewed as a significant, problem. And Ethereum, obviously, there's a defined plan to go with this Casper and with sharding and a couple of other advancements to the platform that will, not only reduce their energy consumption because of the proof of stake implementation that is about to happen before the end of the year, I believe, and so that is going to increase, the cost of doing transaction. I'm not talking about the cryptocurrencies market value thing, but I'm talking about the actual cost of doing the gas transaction cost. That has been, kind of getting stable more and more. And so in order for enterprise applications to create new distributed apps, decentralized apps, and then release, that cost aspect has to be very important. And so just observing the last 90, 120 days of like actual Ethereum network itself is kind of getting very stable. And so we would be able to predict, what it would cost to run an application within the platform. So that will become very clearly published, type of a thing in the next 12, 24 months. And as far as the private blockchain, and I really think, not from the custody, that standpoint, Jim, but I think, how, database, relational database or network database and then relational database lived inside mainframe. But then when Microsoft came up and, started putting the desktop computers on people's desktop, and they came up with Microsoft Access, which is like a private database in a way. So I think, inside enterprise, inside the firewall, there is going to be, a certain amount of like, something like Hyperledger type, applications that will also kind of, become not mainstream, but more of an enterprise software development side. They will take an important part of it.
So I'm very sorry to say, right when there's a disagreement on the panel, that our time is up. And so thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.